There is an ancient Chinese story about a Chinese butcher who had a cleaver that he never sharpened in 20 years. And he was asked one day what his secret might be. He said, well, I have noticed that there is a space between the bones of the animals, and this space is needed for the joints to move. And I always apply my cleaver in that space, and that is how I lay aside the bones, and I never have to sharpen my cleaver. The story is really told by one who popularized the message of Lao Tzu, the Chinese father of Tao. It is really a message of grace, and it came upon the earth in a different way through Jesus Christ. At the time that Jesus appeared, the world was really no better off than we are today. Its problems were under different names, but essentially, man was lost. Man did not know where to go to find the truth. Man was either enslaved to powers outside of himself, or to persons, or to his own ignorance. And the situation was so grave that it was necessary at that moment in history, just as the sun must shine and the rain must fall, at that moment there had to be a shower of words, of divine intelligence, a light. And this light that came spoke to men who had no ears and no eyes. It gave them words, and these words fell upon stony ground, upon places that could not produce the fruit of the seed of the intelligence that had shined from on high. But fortunately, the words were preserved. And though there may have been changes, alterations, the essence of that message is very vibrant today, waiting for all who can absorb it and are willing to pay the price of following it. It has been called the greatest message ever delivered to the human race, the Sermon on the Mount. And it does some very unusual things. It presents a completely new God. It erases all primitive notions about God. It also presents a completely new man. It erases all primitive notions about who man of earth is. It gives him an opportunity to stop stumbling, to stop paying a tithe to the ignorance of the world around him, and to find out that he is really a self-sufficient individual. Now, it may come as a shock to all of us to learn that although we have pretended even to ourselves that we understood the message of the man, that we could run right down those Beatitudes and say, well, of course I understand them. One day it comes to us and says, well, you understand them, but do you really? Are you living them? Was it just something you read one day? Or did it change your life? Did it bring forth the immortal creature where the mortal once stood? What have you really done about those Beatitudes? One woman called the other day. She asked for help about her hands. And then she says, what can I also do to help myself while you're working on this? And I suggested she might work with the Lord's Prayer more carefully. And she said, well, then I'm on the right track because I say the Lord's Prayer every morning. Her emphasis was on, I say the Lord's Prayer every morning. I didn't bother at the moment to tell her that she could say it forever with no result whatsoever. Because the saying of it, or the saying of the Beatitudes, is like reading the menu in a restaurant. You're still going to be hungry if that's as far as you go. Now, when I looked at these Beatitudes again, I was startled too. Because I know that although I see what they mean, they are still not bone of my bone. They are not flesh of my flesh, and they must be. And then came an interesting illumination about them. And so I ask you now, what is it that you lack in this world? Make a list. Perhaps you're poor in health. Perhaps you're poor in finances. Perhaps you're poor in customers or clients or companionship. Perhaps you're poor in many things, in understanding, in justice, in friends, in possessions. And you can begin to see that as you expand the various degrees of poverty you think you have, you may come up with a list of 50 different items, some material things, some emotional, some sociological, some economic. And there you'll say, there, I'm poor in all of these things. And along comes the master and says, that's right, according to your naked eyes, you are poor in all of these things. And if you want to spend 50 more lifetimes, you still will be poor in those things, or you will change your list to another list and be poor in 50 other things, if you keep going about it the way you have been going about it. And then he revealed the great new higher dimension. Nobody is poor in anything. We're only poor in the forms, in the effects, in the images. What we're really poor in is one thing alone: the substance from which the images are formed. And being rich in that one substance, we have all of the effects we thought we lacked. We're no longer poor in health, we're rich in health. We're no longer poor in finances, we're rich in finances. We're no longer poor in the things of this world because they are added unto us. But we must first take the step of realizing that poverty is never in things. That is the illusion of poverty. If you are poor in spirit, you are poor in all things. And so he made that his first beatitude. The moment you realize that you are poor only in spirit, you're on the path. For at that moment you know that as soon as I attain even a measure of the substance called spirit, in that moment I am enriched, and the substance being my possession, it will now form itself as all the things that I have need of. And the moment we know then that we are only poor in spirit, that is the moment we are ready to be blessed. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven, because they have the substance of heaven. And this then was the revelation to an unheeding world that this is a universe of spirit. And deeper down would follow the knowledge that if spirit is the substance of the universe, spirit is my substance. And so at the very same moment he was revealing spiritual identity. Your identity as spirit, the identity of your neighbor as spirit, the identity of the universe as spirit, and the identity of God as spirit. And clearly, if all is spirit, then God is the only spirit, the only one, the only being. And now, all in one fell swoop, he had shown us that there is one power in the universe. Only one. And all of the powers of lack and limitation and disease, even death itself, were imaginary powers existent only because man did not yet know that he was lacking in the one spiritual selfhood that he did not recognize on the earth. Having it, having his spiritual self restored to his consciousness, having a spiritual consciousness, man discovers himself to be the immortal self, the one, without opposite, possessing all of the spiritual qualities of spirit. And then the Bible is alive. All that spirit hath is thine, because thou art my spirit. Did you say you were lacking in these 50 things? They are all included and embodied in my spiritual selfhood. And then the journey has begun. Now we have this great strength of knowing that I have only one goal: the realization of my spiritual selfhood. Having it, I have all. And as this begins, as this conviction deepens, as nothing in this universe can stop you from the attainment of that which you know is self, you're faced with the first problem. What am I going to do with this fellow, this man of flesh? And it tells you to mourn for him. It tells you that if you wish to be Christed, you must mourn for the man of flesh that you thought you were. It tells you to lay aside the garment of mortality. It tells you to realize that man of flesh never was even living. He is a dead corpse. It tells you to mourn for the dead corpse that you called your human self. It tells you to lay aside the dead concepts, the dead beliefs, the dead ideas. It tells you to lay aside all of the beliefs of the counterfeit human mind. Yes, we were interested in being enriched spiritually, but we can only do it when we will lay aside the material self. We are being told to impersonalize life, to take off the persona, the mask of mortality, and to permit ourselves to accept, not on blind faith anymore, but on the assurance of the Master within, that there is a spiritual universe all around us in which perfection abounds without opposite. And so have we been touched sufficiently to serve this inner spirit, or do we wish to continue in mammon, seeking the physical possessions of the world? This is where we determine the second beatitude and its position in our life. Are we ready to mourn, to lay aside the false dead self? Are we ready to begin anew another life as a child again? A new beginning, a new dimension, a grander vision of what life should be. And if we answer in the affirmative, then we begin the third beatitude. We are meek. Not to our fellow man at all. We are meek to the Father within. We are meek unto the Spirit. We are moving now as pilgrims. We have learned that there is an infinite spirit, a transcendental spirit, which individualizes as the Father within. And if the outer man will make an adjustment to permit that vital contact with the inner man, this infinite transcendental spirit will function where we stand in our living experience. And so we become receptive. We develop the listening ear. We seek the guidance of that Father within. We say, "Speak, Father. Thy servant heareth. I am a servant of the Most High. I listen for my Father's voice, the shepherd within." And as the Father guides, we become the outer fingertips of the infinite. We only move as we are moved. The outer becomes the visible expression of the inner. The mind is no longer on the throne. The soul is guiding. The soul is teaching. The soul is becoming the power that furnishes all that is needed in this experience. So we are lifted through this meekness to the Spirit into higher realizations of self, and we come into that great area called righteousness. This is what we had hungered for and thirsted for. This was the pearl of great price for which we were willing to sell all that we possessed. Righteousness. But not my righteousness, not self-righteousness, not the righteousness of this human mind and body, but the righteousness of the Father within. The righteousness which says, my thoughts, my guidance, my will in you is righteousness. And until you have opened yourself through meekness, through mourning, through the confession of spiritual poverty to my will in you, you do not rise to the level where you can be an outer expression of the infinite in all its glory. This righteousness is the righteousness that exceeds the righteousness of the Pharisees, of the scribes, of the church, of man whose breath is in his nostrils. For it is not a human righteousness. It is divinity expressing itself, pouring itself forth from the deepest recesses of your own soul. It is infinite guidance appearing locally. And thus you are in the right use of all the faculties that you have. In this righteousness we feel the power of God. We feel the power of the Spirit. We can feel the doors open around us. We can feel invisible sunlight. We can hear invisible music, inaudible music. We can feel the power of the infinite. This righteousness is the beginning of the new dispensation. Instead of karmic law, instead of subservience to man, instead of subservience to the elements, instead of subservience to all of the visible lacks and limitations of the world, we break the law of karma. But it is really broken for us. The opposites diminish, dissolve, disappear. There is no hate, there is only love. There is no lack, there is only fulfillment. There is no injustice, there is only the law of divine justice. Because righteousness is now the only power functioning in us. We have transcended the opposites. You can tell when this is happening in you because it takes you into the next beatitude. You find you have the quality of mercy. And the reason you do is because as you look out with righteousness, the will of the Father in you governing you, you look past the forms. You do not judge the effects, the images. You know now that forgiveness is not a human quality at all. Forgiveness is a divine self within, recognizing itself without everywhere. The divinity of your being looks out at your fellow neighbor and beholds the invisible Christ. That is your mercy. It is a recognition of the invisible self, the Son of God, everywhere. And so once more, we are blessed by this new higher vision. We are merciful, and unknown to us, it was only through this ability to rise to the level of divine forgiveness that we too could be forgiven, that we too could be made white as snow. For now we are judging no man, and we are not judged by man. The mercy we are extending to the world is measured back unto us, because we have sent out only the good, and only the good can return. All the bread we cast upon the waters at this level is love. Nothing can return to you except love, for that is the law. And soon we find we have no enemies, we have no debtors, we have no antagonisms. We are reaching that glorious place where the righteousness of the Father within, having purified us of the dross of human resentments, human antagonisms, human judgments, we are in conscious union with the Father. We are in the unconditioned universe. We are free. We have found the real freedom, the freedom of spiritual consciousness, which we could never find in a body or in a mind. And now we are a free, transparent channel for the infinite. In this level of purity, we are the pure in heart. There is no personal self intervening. There is no glass darkly. There is no thinker. There is only the Spirit expressing where you stand as your very being. This level, the pure at heart, is the Christing. This is the Christ consciousness. This is infinity where you stand. Now we have discovered then in these 6 steps that Jesus was teaching the world that what they saw with a 3-dimensional eye was not the creation of God. He was teaching them that all men on earth were in a state of cosmic hypnosis, accepting powers that did not exist, conditions that were unreal, living under a condition of karmic law, living under the belief of divine punishment. And in 6 steps, he delineated the path that he himself had already followed. Not his theories, but his tested, proven, dependable demonstration that if you begin with the realization that your only need is spirit, that all that exists is spirit, and if you consecrate your time and effort to the realization of spirit everywhere, through putting off the old man, dedication to that spirit within, letting it dwell in you and you dwell in it until the moment of freedom from this cosmic mind, you would then be lifted to the place where the eye of you would lift all men unto you, where you could unsee that which human eyes declared, where you would become a witness of the Most High. And then finally the Christing, the initiation the opening of the kingdom of heaven on earth to you. And still we're a bit short of the mark. We're untested. We have to still go through that testing period. And so he tells us, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. And here is where you discover if this is for you or not. Judas couldn't make it. The acid test was too much for him. But when you have the ability to look at the persecutions of the world around you, the horrors, the corruption, the evil, and all that seems to be beyond the control of man, when you can also look at the subtle persuasions within yourself, those little invisible persecutors of your own mind, and can face all this with the knowledge that you cannot be moved from spiritual identity, which is the realization of omnipresent perfection, and that every problem that presents itself to you is nothing more than the acid test of your conviction, then you will know that you have touched the higher consciousness. You will know it was necessary, too, because the word in you must be sealed. You must pass through that acid test. In fact, he goes a step further. He says, rejoice. Rejoice when you are persecuted. Why? Because so persecuted they the prophets before you. That's how these men came into their highest state. Every persecution, every lack, every limitation, every form of adversity, however severe it appears to the naked eye, is cementing home for you, if you are ready, the realization that in the spiritual universe, these persecutions are pure mirage. If they're real to you, then you've got to go back to step number 1, 2, 3, and 4 and find out where there was a flaw in your understanding. When you follow them carefully, when you come to the 6th step, the 6th beatitude, pure at heart, pure in heart, you should be a perfect transparency so that even the major catastrophes of this world are quickly seen for what they really are. Peace has no opposite. Love has no opposite. Eternality has no opposite. Immortality has no opposite. Abundance has no opposite. Every opposite, anything unlike God, is but a shadow of thought, and you need not remove that condition. You must simply come over that shadow of thought. Now, these Beatitudes represent the almost total message of Christ on earth. The rest of the Sermon on the Mount is a delineation of the meaning of these 6, 7, 8 cardinal points. To be sure, then, that you do not overlook this little area or that little area, he goes on and says, you have heard it said of old. And that means perhaps you have tried to live by the 10 Commandments. Perhaps you have tried to do what you call the right thing. But always, in spite of that, as long as you lived in a human mind, you lived in the human opposites. You could never extricate yourself from war and peace, from love and hate, from lack and abundance, good health and bad health. Always there had to be an up for a down, a black for a white, an in for an out, a high for a low. But now there is a subtle transmutation. The lower becomes the higher. The inner becomes the without. The divine becomes its own expression, and the shadows of imitation fade away. It is said that he went onto a mountain, but you know by now that the only mountain he went on to was the mountain of high consciousness. And he said, "Follow me up this mountain of high consciousness." Actually, this complete Sermon on the Mount was the ordination of his disciples. And to show that he was not intending it only for these 12, when he ordained them, when he gave them these divine principles, he spoke to the world. Others were present. He was demonstrating that this, though it be the consecration of my disciples, it is a universal message. It is for all who will follow me as my disciples in the future. All who will begin by renouncing all the false beliefs in poverty and realizing there is only one poverty in all this world, the poverty of spirit. And then he revealed how from that wisdom we walk out of this world into my kingdom on earth. This was the message of infinite grace. It is called learning how to work without working. Learning how to let the life spirit effortlessly fulfill itself in and as you. That's what the butcher was really saying, who didn't have to sharpen his knife for 20 years. Now, we who have not found this area of grace are not practicing the message of Christ. Actually, Christianity has not been taught on this earth for some 1700 years. You see, Christianity, in its real essence, before it was organized, was a teaching about grace and truth. Man had been taken out of the karmic law and brought from karmic law to grace. And the teachers of Jesus went around in ones and twos explaining the message. At first they taught it to only Jews. They didn't realize themselves that he had taught a universal message. So the earliest teaching was to what they called Jewish Christians. And these fellows still thought it was a sect of Judaism. Paul and Peter eventually took it out of that, particularly Paul. But it was never called Christianity. It was simply a higher order of life that originated inside Judaism, then came out of Judaism, and finally was organized and called Christianity. At which point a very unusual thing happened. All that remained was the name. The teaching of grace and truth was thrown right out the window. The men who organized it had no knowledge of what it meant. And so they immediately put religion right back into old-fashioned Judaism and taught about a God of punishment. They took the old Judaic non-God and made it God. Grace was lost. Truth was lost. The words remained, but there was nobody to teach them or practice them. And as you come up to the 20th century, you find that for 1,700 years, the Beatitudes have been merely black print in a little book called the Bible. And people do what this woman told me they do. I said them this morning. I used to say them too. To do them, to live them, to be them. And then you see that poor in spirit branches out into 7 more meanings. Once you have caught the idea that unless spirit flows through you, you're a branch cut off, you realize there is no place where you can stop that flow. The moment you stop it, you stop consciousness from being your God. There must be infinity flowing at all times, and so we are constantly poor in spirit. That is our greatest wealth. The ability to stay poor in spirit, to let the Spirit flow in, through, and out, and consistently be open for the flow of more. There is no end to infinity, and it must flow through you without interruption. There is no place where you're satisfied. No place where you can say, now I am content. Now I can stop. You might just as well say, now I will stop living. For spirit is life itself. When we tune then to the Father within, we really mean that we are in contact with that infinite spirit which is individualized as our very being. The outer man and the inner man are one. I and the Father within are one. And the Father within is one with the infinite Father. And now we have conscious fulfillment of our mission on this earth. Now we can fulfill our purpose. Now we can glorify the Father. Now we can walk forth on the earth as the Son of God, as the light. We have all read these Beatitudes before. Now we're going to make them ours. For the rest of this book is really about the Beatitudes. The next 9 or 10 chapters are all about the Sermon on the Mount, which in itself is an elaboration of how we can pursue these 8 steps right up to a total rebirth. The new birth is actually the receptivity to the light of the Father within. It births itself. It takes you out of the sphere of reincarnation after reincarnation into the sphere of transition into the kingdom. Now, with that as a preliminary, let's just dwell for a moment in the silence and go through our Beatitudes within ourselves, applying them to ourselves, somewhat like this. As I receive the spiritual impulse from within, I am becoming enriched in the Spirit. removes all responsibility on my part. It says, "Come unto me." No matter how you are laden, my yoke is easy. I am the Spirit, the Father within. And I am here. I am living. I am present. I am not a future heaven. I am now. Let go of that old fellow, that mortal mind. Don't try to think this out. Don't cling to yesterday. Don't cling to your beliefs. Don't be cautious. Don't be concerned. Let go and trust the spirit of your own being. Let that other fellow die. You will be comforted. Develop the inner ear now and listen at all times. Remember, the Father within is not far away. Right where you stand, I am. Closer than your own heartbeat, I am. I, in the midst of thee, am ready to take on the burden of your life completely. Be meek unto me, for I will lift you into the realm of righteousness. I will be your way, your wine and your water. I will appear as a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. I will appear as food on your table. I will look out through your eyes, and I will hear through your ears. I will be your pulse. I will be your fortress. I will be your sword. And I will be the love that pours through you into the world. Trust me. Lean on me. Lean not on thine own understanding. For I am come. And now look out at your fellow man and love him. Let me, through you, love him. For I will show you that only the Spirit of God surrounds you in all this world, no matter what your eyes may see. I will show you wholeness where the eye sees fractions. I will show you peace where the eye sees war. I will show you inner peace, a peace so deep that it will pass all mortal understanding. I am the peacemaker within. I show you how to lay aside the feelings of insecurity, of doubt, of anxiety, of fear. For I am the one power. When my presence in you is released, there is only peace. You fear nothing that the world can do. Your peace is deeper than the ocean and higher than the sky. Your peace is the knowledge that I and the Father are one self. And your peace can stand before a mountain and push the mountain into a sea. To your peace, nothing is impossible. Why is all this true? Because when the Spirit of the Lord is upon you, there is freedom. The only freedom that really is. Freedom from every seeming lack. But only through this Spirit that is upon you. How can we be persecuted now? Every form of persecution occurred to the mortal self. I, the Spirit, cannot be persecuted. And I, the Spirit, am your being, realized, attained,
accepted. We're in the land of joy. Rejoice. There are no enemies in spirit. There are no bombs in spirit. There are no lacks and limitations in spirit. Unveil the true self, and you find why it is said that the kingdom is at hand. All this is the salting, the restoring of the Sabbath to the salt. Is there another way? You will find there is none. And if you waste years seeking another way, each way will lead you to the same place. You must find the spirit of your being. You must release yourself to it. And these 1700 years have shown us the folly of turning to human authorities, the folly of seeking a way through religion, through science, through philosophy, through government. There is no such way, because religion, science, government, and philosophy, they too must find that they are poor in spirit. Each must come to this conclusion to begin the birth of the real self. Science offers its cosmic toys. Religion offers its prattle about God. Government offers us this, and finance offers us that. Everywhere we are given theories, ideas, concepts of the counterfeit mind of man, which rejects the illuminated, dependable demonstration of the Christ mind. And that Christ mind gave us the Beatitudes. It never said that this will all come true someday. It said it is true. It didn't say blessed will be. It said blessed are. It was speaking in the present tense, the eternal now tense, that when you have accepted poverty of spirit as your only sin, blessed are the poor in spirit. You have begun the pilgrimage. You're on the path. And once on the path, you cannot be taken away. As you go through the remaining lessons in this book, and as you review what you have done up to now, try to make that adjustment which sees that all you have to do is to begin at the right place, and then slowly take each step until you have a coordinated inner program of knowing that unless I am now in contact with the inner spirit, this day is a human day. This day is a separated day. This day will be a fruitless day, for the human does not bear spiritual fruit. And then why waste that day and that month and that year and that lifetime? Learn from the era of 17 centuries that poverty of spirit is the only poverty in the universe, the only sin, the only crime, for it is the separation from your own being. That is where you begin. And with the right beginning, all else is assured. And so we have the way home to the Father's house that all of the religions of the world have walked by. Why they felt they could invent their own ways, I'll never know. But the human mind is that way. It knows so much better than God. And so we have all thought out our own individual schemes, and religions have given us their schemes. And each one has turned away from the very Spirit itself, which says there is only one way. I am the way. I, Spirit, am the way. I, Spirit, am the identity of your being, unless you are I. There is no way for you. For the creature is not the way. The mind of the creature is not the way. Human authorities are not the way. And you can look through the Sermon on the Mount from the first word to the last, and conspicuously absent is all reference to the fact that in order to find the truth, you must go to God through religion, through the church, through the temple, that you must find some systematic theology. All of this is absent. He was taking us away from that to the kingdom of God within us. You know, and I know, that whoever has felt the kingdom of God within has sufficient proof that it is the way. We also learn that the way is sure. There's very little doubt in the way, because it's always proving itself, always blossoming forth with beautiful signs to tell you you're moving in the right direction. Until there's no self but I. The I that is the way is yourself. You're not a divided self. You're the one self. The one self which knows there's no one in this universe to persecute me. I am the one infinite self-expressing. And then all the mirages of the world, which call themselves powers, are frustrated because you are the way. Now are we the way. I think a little rest would be good for us. And then we'll see what the way has to tell us. Apparently, on the earth, shortly after the demonstrations of Jesus, there were those who had accepted this particular way to inner Christhood. We find evidence of that in 1 John, in the 3rd chapter and 14th verse. He says, "We know that we have passed from death unto life, because we love the brethren. He that loveth not his brother abideth in death." Now, when he says we have passed from death to life, he is referring to the mortal creature, which he refers to as death, and having passed through the steps of the Beatitudes to the acceptance of Christ as self, Spirit as self, into oneness, he is passed out of the mortal creature into the immortal self. And so he calls it, we have passed from death to life. Now there's another passage in John, and that's the 8th chapter, the 24th verse. I said therefore unto you, that ye shall die in your sins. For if ye believe not that I am he, ye shall die in your sins. Now all of our so-called lacks and limitations represent what we call our sins. And we will die in them unless we know that I am he. And that I, which is he, is the I of your being, which is the Spirit of God itself. Be still and know that I, the Spirit of your being, am God. Until this union has been brought about, there will always be a mortal creature saying, why does God permit evil on the earth? Why does God let the streams be polluted? Why does God grab my son and send him off to shoot and be shot at? Always the belief that God is doing these things, when it is we who are rejecting the very presence of God in the midst of us. Now we are told that we are blessed if we do this, that, and the other thing. Let's see how we are blessed. What is the meaning of these blessings? In one case it says, ours is the kingdom of heaven. In another it says we shall be comforted. In another it says we shall inherit the earth. We shall be filled. We shall obtain mercy. We shall see God. We shall be called the children of God. Again, ours is the kingdom of heaven. Is there any of us wants more than the kingdom of heaven? To be known as the child of God, to inherit the earth? And you know, the funny thing is, if you want less, you're doomed to failure. Under divine law, you cannot want less than the kingdom of heaven, to be called a child of God, to inherit the earth. You cannot have less. Any less is unreality. You will notice that each of these promises is the revelation that only the Spirit of God walks the earth. And you may also notice that there is no healing, no so-called miracle demonstrated by Jesus on earth which did not include the 8 Beatitudes. So completely had he overcome the human mind that these were one actual consciousness. Now, if you were to say that you are all-knowing, you would then take your all-knowingness and find that in this world, your all-knowingness becomes eye, ear, nose, touch, taste. 5 methods of knowing, which are really part of the one knowing. Now, these 8 Beatitudes are all part of the one knowing. They are the facets of Christ consciousness. And having reached the level where these in Jesus were one consciousness, you can apply it to the loaves and fishes, to the healing of anyone in the Bible, and you will see that every healing is really these 8 steps in an instantaneous sequence. And let's look at it that way for a moment. We have the hungry without food. They are poor in food, but they're really poor in spirit. We have the cripple. He's poor in health, but he's really poor in spirit. We have the demoniac. He's poor in mentality, but he's really poor in spirit. We have the dead, Lazarus. He's poor in life. Yes, because he's poor in spirit. Wherever there is a poverty, it is a poverty of spirit masquerading as a poverty of a thing or a condition. But there is also present the witness of spirit, which is Jesus the Christ, who is not poor in spirit, because I am the Spirit. And wherever that Spirit stands as a witness, that which was poor in something is recharged by the presence of a spiritual witness, and that Spirit redeems or dissolves the poverty of the appearance and replaces it with the enrichment of the spiritual wholeness, which is fulfillment and the absence of poverty. Now, Jesus had reached the level when he could see this poverty of food for thousands, and within himself, like a computer, they're only poor in spirit. They're not meek unto the Spirit, but I will be meek unto the Spirit. I will mourn for the false self they present. I will crucify in my consciousness that false self that they present to me. I will be meek unto the Spirit. I will let the righteousness of Spirit exude its own perfection in all things. Spirit will be merciful to the hungry. Spirit will be the pure in heart of my being, which says evil, lack, limitation is impossible. And so in your pure at heart stage, which is a stage where you and I should be at this point, that's where we should be practicing our strength. To be looking out pure at heart, saying within ourselves, but if God is there, how can evil be there too? How can God and evil coexist in the same place? And if I accept the evil, I have denied the presence of God. If I accept any condition unlike God, I am denying the presence of God. And so in your pure at heart stage, you're saying, but that can't be. God is. You're living in the kingdom of is instead of the world of is not. Where is the difference? The difference is in your consciousness. All that is out there is the kingdom of is. But to that consciousness which has not attained the pure at heart stage, the world of is not is also out there. And usually very little of the kingdom at all. Now, if we're practicing the perfection of God as being omnipresent, we are resolutely facing all that denies that presence, but we in our pure at heart consciousness are saying, I don't care if there's 5,000. God being present, fulfillment is present. Whatever is necessary for that hunger is present here and now. I can't do it, but the Spirit, which is my true name, it doeth the works. I cannot limit the Spirit to my mentality. And then you're inviting the world to throw its burdens upon you. Why? Because you're ready to let the Spirit show itself wherever the burdens appear. There are no burdens for Spirit. And so we are dying to death to be born of life. Dying to the negatives, and not just changing the negatives to positives. That isn't enough. The world is very satisfied to do that, and makes a mistake in doing so. Because the moment you're changing negatives to positives, and satisfied that that is as far as you want to go, you have become stagnant to the flowing Spirit. Let's go a few steps that are not in this chapter, and let's see that where we're looking today, everywhere, we're not really looking at persons, we only think we are. What you're looking at is a state of consciousness. Now we're going to get somewhat mystical here, so let's go into it not with the sharp-pronged mind, but with a consciousness of the presence of spirit. Here stands a consciousness, and it is outpicturing its concept of God. And that concept of that consciousness which comes out is a fraction. God is all and God is whole. And God is infinite. And this consciousness before me outpictures a fraction, and it is called a human being. And so with myself, to the degree that my consciousness can receive God, it then outpictures its concept, and it is called a human being. Now we have all that is present is God, the perfect Spirit itself. We have a consciousness about that Spirit, and we have its pictured, visible concept called form. Now when you function on the level of the form, you are a concept, and you are going to function with other concepts called forms, and there will be no God government. But if one of the two forms, yourself, recognizing that the form you see before you is but a level, a projection of that consciousness, and that you, visibly, physically, are a projection of your consciousness, you will step out of the belief in the forms, back into the consciousness, and recognize that your limited, invisible consciousness, which outpicture this limited, visible form, is not your real consciousness at all. Divine consciousness, God is all there is. And that is where you drop all of the concepts of that limited consciousness concerning this form. Your limited human consciousness is that which you mourn for. That is what you die to. And as you do that, you are becoming a witness for the divine consciousness. You are losing the enslavement to the karmic law which governs all human consciousness. You are dying to unreality. You are coming out of the law. You are yielding to the divine. And this human mind is being released from both its burden, its concept, its conditioning, and its believed responsibilities. It is to become a witness for the Most High. Now, there are many types of consciousness. We have thought there was just the human consciousness or the divine. But between the human and the divine is the cosmic consciousness, which is really the cosmic imitation of the divine. And in this cosmic imitation, there are many, many, many kinds of consciousness. As a matter of fact, there's nothing on this earth that could appear without it being in that cosmic consciousness first. There couldn't be a bird unless there was a bird consciousness. It couldn't rain unless there were rain consciousness. The sun couldn't shine unless there was sun consciousness. An insect couldn't appear without insect consciousness. Nothing visible is what is there at all. All that is there is the consciousness that produced that visible. And now we're going backstage. We're going behind the visible forms to the consciousness that brings them out. Is there an epidemic? Then there is a consciousness that produces the epidemic. And it is not a one-person consciousness. It is a group consciousness. Is there hate in the world? Then there is a hate consciousness. Do you see that behind every idea that appears in this world as a thing, person, place, or condition, there is an individual or a group consciousness producing it. And these interwoven consciousnesses within the cosmic are the father of this world. When you go out to defend against the people, or to influence the people, or to in some way get something from the people, you're dealing with forms that are nothing but objectified consciousness. When you meet the consciousness at its own level inside and recognize it for what it is, an imitation, you can then move past your own limited imitation consciousness, not wasting your time with the forms, not seeking the client, not seeking the profit, not seeking the health, not seeking the abundance, because these could only be the appearance from consciousness. And so you get behind to the false consciousness which is producing bad health, the false consciousness which is producing bad economy, the false group consciousness which produces inflation and deflation. You find that behind the visible defects of the world are the fractional consciousnesses causing them. And when you can see through these fractional consciousnesses, you can watch inflation and deflation and know it hath no power over the divine consciousness that is. We are unmasking the forms. We are going backstage to the actors who are sending out these false forms. And then we are seeing the unreality of all that is not divine consciousness, and that is our ultimate freedom. As you stand in your divine consciousness, the false fractional consciousnesses of the world, whether they're sending up deluges or fires or floods or inflation or deflation, they must be subservient to the divine consciousness of your being. They cannot enter your divine consciousness to defile it. And then through the law of externalization, your divine consciousness becomes the law of the outer in the midst of inflation and deflation. Your divine consciousness becomes a law of the outer in the midst of the bomb and the bullet. Because all there is a fractional consciousness making a bomb and a bullet appear. A fractional consciousness making a lack and a limitation appear. The appearances are the images formed outwardly by the inner consciousness. You don't have to overcome the images. You have to overcome the acceptance of the images, knowing that they are both only the visible expression of an invisible false consciousness. The only consciousness that is present on the entire earth, which is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, is the consciousness that Jesus recognized. My Father's consciousness is here, and therefore they will be fed now. My Father's consciousness is here, and it cannot make anything less than a whole self. So this man is not insane. This one is not hungry. This one is not dead. but it is the acceptance of the whole invisible consciousness of the Father, where the invisible false consciousness of the world in its many aspects is holding sway over the ignorant false consciousness of the observer. Now, if we have gone behind the visible scene and even uncovered to some degree today the false consciousness of mortal mind, we are getting away from this hard and fast, rigid, physical world which has monopolized mankind since the very beginning. We are seeing the powers that are causing the visible powers. And as we understand these invisible powers, we learn that they're not even there. That's where the hypnosis begins, in the cosmic consciousness. And then it translates outwardly into the invisible individual consciousness, and then finally into the visible world as the things that we have given power. From this, you develop your own awareness that the power is not in these things or in the invisible consciousness that produce them. The power is in your being. You are self-sufficient in Christ. Lack dissolves in this knowledge. Limitation dissolves in this knowledge. The will enforces itself through your consciousness that only the consciousness of God is present there and here. Now, as we firm that up, we prove it. And then no longer can the world say that the word of Christ is only in a book. The word of Christ, no longer received in your mind, but in your heart, becomes a living word. And you are the livingness of it. Every healing that will ever take place spiritually will be a composite of the 8 Beatitudes, and the necessity to heal is the persecution that faces you. You face it rejoicing that only Christ, only God, only the Father and the Son, one, are present. There is no other. And God is revealed. "5 minutes, 10 minutes, or 5 years or 10 years, depending on the degree to which you have accepted divine principle and rejected the suppositional opposite called the human mind. You can't fool anybody. You can't fool yourself. Because deep down within, while your mouth is saying, I accept, if there is still something inside that says, I'm not quite sure, it will show up. The pure at heart have passed the point of a divided consciousness. Someone said to me, at my age, can I attain this? If someone had said to me 6 or 7 years ago that 6 or 7 years from now you'd feel you've come close to it, I'd have said, what are you talking about? The message of the Christ isn't something you attain. That's part of the delusion. You do not attain it. It is already yours. Now, it has been yours from the beginning, before the foundations of the world. What we have neglected to be aware of is that we do not attain it, we accept that we have it. We peel away those artichoke and onion skins that tell us we do not have it, and there it is, waiting. I've been here all this time, and you have been seeking me where? Out there. Going around the world looking for a holy grail that you possess in your very being. You do not attain Christ, you are. And how quickly this is realized is perhaps voiced best in one of those Beatitudes. Blessed are they who hunger and thirst for righteousness. The measure of your desire for the truth determines how quickly, at least it's one of the great determining factors, how quickly you will come into the realization that I am He. And then you will see that the Father would never give us this glorious teaching without the knowledge that we will all bend to it, accept it, and finally live it. But if we were not to attain it, if 10 years or 20 from now we still had not attained it, there is still an important truth to know. That the measure of your spiritual consciousness is all that you take with you when all of your earthly possessions are checked at the probate court. And I have one student who said the most beautiful thing I heard in a long, long time. Just recently, an author came to town, this fellow Starkey. And when we had lunch, I decided to tell him about it. He felt that he was going to teach. He was veering more and more to teaching the young. So I had to tell him this because it helped me. One day I was saying to my student, lately, most of the women coming to me are in their 75s and their 80s, and I'm quite surprised. And she looked at me, and with a smile on her face, she said, it's wonderful to have those prenatal cases. I told this to Starkey. He incidentally had run the Infinite Way in New York up to about 1960. And was a close friend of Joel's, obviously. And his face lit up like a moon. He just reached for a paper, he reached for a pen, he just couldn't get it quick enough, and then he wrote down big words, prenatal. I'm sure he'll never have an old patient again. There aren't any such things. We're either being prepared for the next incarnation or for the transition. And fortunately, that's not just a pretty word, it's the truth. And so let's see that the journey is not just one lifetime. Let's not sandwich God into this little span between the cradle and the grave. We are that spirit. We are continuous, uninterrupted life. Humanly, we would like to have it this minute. Perhaps we cannot. Perhaps we can. But the next 500 years won't make any difference. When that moment comes, that then becomes the same as the now that is here at this moment. And at that moment, you'll have what you want. You might be one of those who's been prepared like an iceberg, so that all that now is needed is the salad dressing on the top. In your heart, you can tell. If you feel that tremendous power, which is saying, I am now, I am come, open the consciousness and let me in. Be sure where the Christ is, all time is vanished. There is no passing time in Christ. The moment that Christ enters your consciousness, you're in the eternal and now. and you can never be budged out of it. So we have our Beatitudes. They prepare us for what follows after ye have heard it said of old. And what follows is, Moses taught you this way. The Old Testament taught you this way. But I, the Spirit of God in the midst of you, I say unto you, not that way, not an eye for an eye, not a tooth for a tooth. I say unto you, you are the power. There is only one power on the earth, and it is the spirit of your being. I say unto you that the only real Christianity is one power. There is no Christianity in two powers. There is no two-ness anywhere. There is only I in the midst of you. And whatever they have told you of old is no more. For I say unto you, now are we the sons of God. And as this I continues to tell us the difference between the old way, the Old Testament, and the New Testament of I, the Spirit of God within you, we are learning real Christianity from the source, from the Christ within. That's the only Christianity there is. And it speaks with authority. And so they said of Jesus, he speaks as one with authority. And the reason they said it is because the Christ had spoken, not a man. And when Christ speaks in you, you have the only authority there is on this entire earth. And that authority you can depend on. It says, I am the way. And that means you can depend right now that it is the way. And it will continue to be the way until all that is unlike itself is eliminated from your life. For its way is the way of perfection, without opposite. And the greatest knowledge you can have about that is to know that is not tomorrow, that is the reality now. This is where we should dwell a moment. The perfection of my being is now. And through the Christ message, I am alerted to the subtle deceiving of the cosmic mind which paints before me the imperfections that have no substance within them, no power to fulfill themselves, except from the belief that we mistakenly have given them. Remove that belief, and you will find those powers are non-power. Those appearances are non-appearance. For all that is here now is I, the infinite invisible Spirit of God, the one. And beside me there is no other. Joel is going to take us further next week. But there is a very clear impression that through this series now, we are going to crucify that which is unlike God. We are moving through the resurrection as an experience instead of a word in a book. Let's all hold tight to one another in the realization that we are unseparated. Now, if you want some homework, you don't have to wait for anyone to come to you and say, help me. There is a consciousness of disease in this world. Take it. Face it. Unmask it. Lift yourself above it. And that's your homework. There is a consciousness of hate in this world. Dwell with that a moment until you overcome that consciousness. Take the consciousness of everything in this world that you think is wrong, imperfect, lying, and recognize the consciousness behind it. Unmask it with the truth in your own being. And that's your homework. You can never say, I lack for things to do. The false consciousness of the world surrounds us, and your awareness of it is the unmasking of it and the nullifying of it. This is the kind of world work we can all be doing. Not only is it helpful, but it is self-liberating. It builds that halo, that immunity around your being just by the knowledge that all the hate in the world has no power in the divine consciousness. And then relax. All of the lack in the world has no power in divine consciousness. Accept the challenge of the newspapers, not with resistance, with wisdom, with silence, with truth in consciousness. And rest in the Word. And you'll find the Beatitudes are forming themselves in the very midst of your being. You're behind the visible world. And you're able to look at the false consciousness of the visible world in its multitudinous forms and see it as the nothingness that it is. You remember that phrase we worked with a while back, there is no place where God is not. There is no place where God consciousness is not. No place where the activity of God is not. No matter what we see. That is what I, in the midst of you, has ever been saying to you. We might even get to Easter before Easter gets here. Thanks very much.
Thank you.